Charlie Kirk, the person who shot him, clearly think that the only way to solve the problem is to go and kill the guy. But whether or not you agree with his ideas, to me, that's beside the point, because the point was he took very hard-line positions on issues. And when you take very hard-line position on issues, the polarity is that there is also an opposite view. USA is highly polarized today. You can't solve that problem. You have to learn to manage it. The way to manage this...
Welcome to the Game of Impossible podcast. I'm Leon and this is my dad, Idris Jala. We are a father and son podcast where we discuss all things transformation through the lens of business, leadership, sport, and faith. Dad, these have been interesting times, and I've personally been spending a bit of time thinking about, first of all, grief, and then out of that, thinking about this idea of unity, and then naturally, something that we talk about on this show, which is the distinction between polarities to be managed, problems to be solved. First of all, I'll tell you why I started thinking about grief.
Yeah.
We have been in a season of grief. Just about a week ago, over the weekend, we had to put our dog, Ollie, to rest. We had to put him down. Yeah. And so that was what sort of triggered this thinking about grief. And, out of that, I was thinking about things that are outside of our control. We've seen a lot of unrest as well, both politically, socially as well. I mean, the most recent example would be the assassination of Charlie Kirk. We've also been seeing a lot of unrest in Nepal. Even here on home soil, we have had the big incident at Kampung Sungai Baru the other day with the police chief, the Dangwangi police chief, being stoned.
And they had all of riots in Indonesia as well.
In Indonesia as well. And all of this is sitting on top of a bed of the ongoing needless killing that we see in Gaza as well. And so that got me to think maybe today it would be really worth talking about how one can process maybe injustice, maybe even grief, but to do so in a way that maintains unity. I think those are the things that we can be in control of in the face of things that we are not in control of. Yeah. And so, first of all, what is your take on a lot of what we're seeing now? What we're seeing essentially is a lot of things which should be polarities to be managed, but approached as problems to be solved. Why do you think that is?
I mean, you think about Charlie Kirk, the incident. It's a terrible, tragic incident that someone like him has to be shot, because the person who shot him clearly think that the only way to solve the problem is to go and kill the guy. And that is not the way to do it. So Charlie Kirk built his career encouraging young people to engage with ideas and to debate them so that in a way that young people can shape the country's destiny. So that's what he tried to do. So when he founded Turning Point USA, it was founded on the basis of creating a very small campus movement and then catapulted into a national movement. Really, the idea of getting young people to engage, to shape ideas for making America great again. He's a big supporter of Donald Trump. Yep. But whether or not you agree with his ideas, to me, that's beside the point, because the point was he took very hard-line positions on issues. And when you take very hard-line position on issues, the polarity is that there is also an opposite view on the other side. But he is saying that we should engage. We should talk civilly about it. So he then said, let's just not turn into violence. Let's just engage, talk civilly about it. So he wanted young people to shape and play an active role in society in America. So I think that's the good part of what he's doing. I'm not saying that you should agree or disagree with him, but the point is that you should allow people to have a debate and engage properly and civilly. So because he realized that the only way to create a society that's highly polarized, USA is highly polarized today. I mean, I looked at that society. A lot of people are extremely polarized today. So when you have a polarized society, it means there are two poles, north and south poles. That's a polarity. You can't solve that problem. You have to learn to manage it. The way to manage this is really for people to figure out three steps. You use the word unity earlier on. How do you find a way that you engage but still remain united, still remain constructive, proper decorum with one another? So I think level one, the most basic level in a diverse society, is that when it's highly polarized, it's what I call tolerate one another. That means, let's say I don't like you, we are different, Leon, and I don't particularly like you, but I tolerate you. So that's the most basic. So if you are at the level of basic, then you need to migrate into the level of acceptance. That means I accept that you are different from me, you hold a different view. I respect and accept that you hold a different view. You stand on a different polar, and I stand on a different pole, but I accept that. I completely respect that you're different, and therefore I'm prepared to engage with you. So if we are in that level, if anyone's in that level, we should invite them to move to an even higher level, which is to celebrate our differences in the polarities. So I think people that hold a different view about someone like Charlie Kirk should stand there and start to move from level 1 to level 2 and level 3, from tolerance to acceptance to celebration. Celebration means to look at the positive aspects of what the man is saying and really now say, well, this actually what he's saying is, I like that. I may not agree with all of the things he's saying, the 10 positions he takes, but I do accept 1 and 2. And if 1 and 2 is good, you celebrate them. You say, actually, I don't agree with you in many areas, Charlie, but I do agree with you on 1 and 2. That means you begin to celebrate the differences. I think if you start to do this, migrating people from level 1 to level 2 and level 3, you'll have a society that learn how to manage polarities, because you then not just tolerating, but you now accept, and then you then celebrate the differences. Then you can have a very constructive discussion. But really, such a tragic thing for a young man like him, very young family, very strong in his faith. Think about the grief that the family has to go through. And suddenly, such a young family, the grief that he has got to go through. We all need to condemn this man who took to violence, because to him, the way to deal with this is to solve the problem by killing the man. But that's not the way to do it. That is absolutely the wrong way to do it. The way to do it is to engage in a way that we move ourselves in that ladder that I call it, the ladder of managing polarities, moving from tolerance to acceptance, the right down to celebration. If you can do that, there are so much problem today, differences on religion, for example. You see.
Let's take now, because I also don't want people to misunderstand us.
Yeah.
Talking about Charlie Kirk and thinking, okay, it's very easy for the world to pay attention to the deaths of people who have been in the spotlight like him, regardless of whether you agree with his views or not. And it's easy for us to talk about people like him, but maybe forget the ongoing situation that we've been seeing in Gaza, Palestinians who have been killed. And this again is an example of people failing to treat a polarity to be managed as a polarity to be managed, and treating it as a problem to be solved, in which case, in order to solve the problem, is to wipe out entire communities.
That is absolutely not the right thing to do. Wiping out a community, trying to solve the problem. The reality is the tension between the Israelis and the Palestinians. They must learn to live with one another. Really learning how to live with one another in the way I just described it, from tolerance to acceptance to celebration. So I think very, very important. And so really, the numbers of people that are displaced, the kind of difficulties that people are being put through, just because people now want to solve the problem. Our close relative just passed away in Miri just 3 weeks ago. And I still think about it. We are Christians, but the Muslims' way of burying, they must make sure that they bury the dead before the first sunset. I looked at it, in my mind, I celebrate that being different. I personally like that. I really like the Muslim way of dealing with it because they said, let's do it quick. If you prolong the grief, it's such a difficult for people. So I personally, I like the way that the Muslim do it. Before the sunrise, the sunset, they must bury the dead. And to me, that you must look at things like that.
Yeah. And this is me as well, agreeing with that. I mean, I'm a Christian pastor,
Yeah.
and I look at that and I also think that's a very practical way to do it.
Very practical.
Maybe we should also start
Yeah.
running and conducting our funerals like that as well.
Sometimes we overly go through such a long process.
Yeah.
What you don't realize this, in the old clubby tradition, Leon, when somebody used to die, no, we don't do it now, in the olden days, they will put the body in a jar or a coffin, and depending on which tribe, and they keep that body at the end of the longhouse for almost 30 days, almost a month, with the smell coming out
Just
from
out
there.
in the open.
If you drag it far too long, it's the grief also overwhelm you, because in everybody that comes to the house, you start crying and mourn. I know we all mourn, but I have to say that, you see, that the rites and the rituals, the worst in my view, personally, my view is that the old clubbed way of doing it, putting the dead body there for whole month, to me, that is a very difficult thing to do. And but right on the end of the spectrum is the Muslim way of doing it. And I think that's what I mean by celebrating the differences. I would say today, all people of different faith, we should study other religion and look at why they have those faith and find the reasons what is good in their faith.
Yeah. In fact, when I studied theology, we had to study other faiths as well. Because you can only truly have a real sense of conviction in your own faith if you know where it stands in the context of other faiths. And when you have spent time also understanding where other faiths and people of other faiths come from as well, deeply, not just at a superficial level, but actually you're really coming to read the texts.
Absolutely.
To be honest, there were times when I was doing my studies, a lot of people think, when you study theology, you do it so that you would have a strengthened faith, at the end. Of course, the end outcome was a strengthened faith. But just like when you go to the gym and you lift weights, the process of getting to that level of fitness requires a lot of pain and a lot of wrestling. And so there were times for me, as I was going deep, we were reading these other texts so deeply that even I started to feel, hey, maybe there's more truth in this thing compared to our faith. But then there again is the mystery of faith, right? Like we won't have all the answers.
You don't have all
and
the
which
answers.
is why I think whenever it comes to interfaith dialogue as well. So let's talk about dialogue, because that is essentially what we are propagating here, not to delete other people, but to have healthy dialogue. Even in the space of having dialogue around our own faith, I think we're better able to have healthy discourse if we don't hold our faith and our views too tightly. And by that, I don't mean that we loosen our convictions about our faith.
You have your faith, you have your conviction.
We have our faith and convictions, but when we sit at the table, that we also don't begin to antagonize the other person. I think sometimes we have an inability to separate disagreement with someone and then dehumanizing the person that we disagree with as well. And so I feel, and there's practical wisdom to this, because the FBI negotiator, Chris Voss, said that the way to win a negotiation is ultimately to enter the negotiation, not treating it as a battle, but seeing it as a journey of discovery, to get to know the other person and to show the other side that you are seeking to also understand.
Absolutely. It is very, very true. I mean, you may remember, Leon, you're talking about trying to understand the other side of the poles. When we went and we applied through the government to join our pilgrimage, we all went to the Holy Land to Israel, we went to Jordan, and we went to all this we saw. And we deliberately took one guy who's our tourist guide, who is deeply entrenched, who understands the Bible, he understands the Quran, he understands history. You remember that when we went there, it was wonderful. It was wonderful for me because he gave us so much perspective from the biblical standpoint and the Quran as well, at the same time, historical perspective at the time. Putting them all together was a very rich opportunity for us to see what was happening in the Holy Lands as far as we're concerned. So that was a wonderful trip. To me, I saw that listening to the tourist guide, it was an opportunity to see that two different poles. But then if you can see it, then you understand the origins of Islam as well and how they all came. This all Abrahamic faiths,
yep.
And they all come together, and their original source is people of the book, they call him. And so then you see the points of departures. It's the point of departures, the points of disagreement. They're not really fundamentally different. There's a lot of commonalities in both Islam as well as Christianity, because the original source was the same, and then the points of departure. So I think when you engage into religious conflicts and difficulties, you must always begin looking at the positives on the other side first. And then you then learn to say, you can have a dialogue, you keep your faith, you keep your conviction, but doesn't mean you condemn the other side. And then you just have said, how do we learn how to live together? And I have whole differences, but I respect your difference, your views compared to mine, but we're prepared to engage. Then we find common grounds. If we can find common grounds to move forward, that's the way to deal with polarities, looking for common grounds to move forward.
Do you think there's a point at which maybe sometimes it's too late to be able to manage the polarity, because things like what we're seeing in Gaza, even things like the Charlie Kirk's assassination, I think will further polarize America as well. And we're seeing some of this playing out in social media and some of the ways that different camps are starting to attack each other with so much vitriol. Do you think that there's a point at which it is too late to be able to return to healthy discourse?
There is no such thing as too late, Leon. I mean, to my mind, you must begin somewhere. It's never something too late. But if you leave it to fester, it's going to get worse.
So let's talk practically now.
Practically, the first thing in my mind they need to do in America was to pass a new law to stop the sale of guns so freely. That is a big debate going on in America because gun is so easily available in America. So that's why gun violence is much more pronounced in that country compared to other countries where gun is not freely available. That's a very practical thing to do. And so the second thing that needs to be done is that people need to be taught properly in education how to deal with polarities. I mean, I don't think this idea of problem to be solved versus polarities to be managed is not so well taught in schools and universities. To be clear, let me just repeat the point that you and I talked about before. What is meant by whenever you have conflicts or differences of opinion, you must ask the question, is it a problem to be solved? It's a polarity to be managed. If it's a problem to be solved, it's a disagreement about how to fix a car. The way to deal with this, to go to a mechanic, that's the expert. He tells you how to fix the car. Polarities to be managed is no right and wrong. We just have two different opinions to it. And so because we accept the fact there's no right and wrong, we got to learn how to then identify and agree common areas, and then how to then do what's called give and take. Compromises is the way forward. Let me say, things that are polarities normally come from a few areas. One is deep-rooted conviction and belief, such as religious belief. That's a source of polarity. Another one is habits that is so intractable. If you have that particular habit and that's entrenched in you, that's also a polarity. For example, if you want to be always just on time, and I like to be well ahead of time, that's a habit. And that's very difficult to kick. It's an addiction, it's also a habit. That's also another thing that causes a lot of polarities.
By the way, that's not the real dynamic here. I do also like being early, just in case people were wondering.
No. And so and then the other one is, another source of polarity is political positions. This is a big polarity. So, and I call that tribes. I general term for it, tribes. That means it can be politics, which political party you come from, whether Republican or Democrat, whether you are conservative or Labour in the US. That's also a form of polarity. When I call it tribe, it means like Chelsea versus Manchester United. That's also a cause of polarity. Although it's a form of sport, you will find have been so many instances where the crowd became so rowdy, they erupt into violence as well. And so those are the three main sources of polarities that exist. And so really the only way you can move forward when you'd have to deal with this, recognize you can't solve those problems. You got to learn to manage them by doing compromises, give and take, identify common areas, respect the other difference of opinion, and be prepared to engage civilly without trying to solve the problem through violence.
Yeah, I want to touch on a practical outworking of this. Let's take a workplace.
Yeah.
Now, we have had quite a few in the past couple of months, quite a few maybe trickier pastoral cases, either with people who are a part of our congregation or sometimes even internally as well, with differences of opinions. And so we've been really thinking about this idea of talking to people rather than talking about people. And one way that we try to facilitate that is if someone has a grievance with another person, and naturally, most people tend to not bring it up directly with the person in question. And so what would sometimes happen is person A would maybe come to me or to one of the leaders and say, I have an issue with person B. And in most cases, sometimes then the leader might feel like, you know what, I just want to listen, maybe even fanning the flame a little bit and agreeing with them. But one of the things that I found personally has been quite helpful is to say upfront that I will listen to you and I will take this meeting for you to share and air your grievance about these other people, but on the condition that once you and I have had that initial conversation, that you would use this conversation as a way for you to externally process how you feel, so that you might be ready to speak to this person directly. And when you feel you are ready, I would also offer myself to be part of that, to help to moderate that. And so I would say, if you're okay with those conditions, then I'm happy to chat with you, to hear about what this thing is. But if not, I suggest you cool off and wait for another time and talk to the person directly, because I'd rather you guys sorted it out together. That is how you're able to arrive at the compromise, like you say.
Absolutely.
Versus you telling me and then me bringing it up to this person, and it's in the end, it's only gonna create even more disunity, because to the other person it will look like, why did you rat me out to the boss and to the senior? Whereas if you just say, I'm just here to help you to process and maybe give you some pointers on how you might bring it to the other person, then I think that makes for a much more healthy dynamic. And sometimes that just also means that the conversation might be difficult, but unless we're willing to have the difficult conversation and spend time in that discomfort, what we can find is that the issue will fester. It will fester silently. So it's far better to deal with something and risk maybe even a bit of an eruption at the time, but an eruption that ultimately brings clarity for both sides. So I would say that is a practical way to manage polarities in the workplace. If you are someone in leadership, but if you are managing upwards as well, maybe that could be something. If you feel you need to vent something to your boss, tell your boss, I would like to share a grievance, but I want to be clear, I don't want this to be just a complaining session. I will bring it up to the other person directly, but I want to process my thoughts with you and maybe get your thoughts as well on how I might have a more constructive conversation. And maybe if you would be so kind to be part of that, if you wouldn't mind moderating that discussion as well. That shows your boss that you're not just here to complain, but that you've already thought about how you're going to deal with the subject matter or deal with the issue directly. And it also shows that you're asking for your boss's guidance as well.
Something similar what the Japanese do. They call it ringi. The Japanese, if they have a contention or they have polarities and differences of opinion that are so entrenched within the organization, what they then do is they identify and appoint what they call an empowered facilitator. So this person is the mediator, but they call the person empowered. Because the way they then do is, the ringi process, the term ringi is a Japanese term to describe pulling out the tree to look at the root. That means the tree, the root cause is down below. If you and I have a disagreement, we try to engage, it will erupt into serious difficulties. That's why this empowered facilitator will come to me and then have a discussion with me to then pull the tree, look at the root cause of the differences. And then he'll come to you and ask for your opinion. And he needs in views, and then the first thing he realizes in his dialogue with me and dialogue with you, he discovers common grounds that you and I don't disagree. Then he comes back round 2. Then he said, actually, Idris, I've spoken to Leon. I have seen that there are common grounds where you don't disagree. You actually agree in these areas. He lays the common ground. Then he says, out of 10 issues, there are 9 things that you have common grounds. There's only one area you don't agree, and this is this area. Let me now figure out a solution. He proposes a solution. Then I say, well, in that compromise, I might accept it if you modify it this way. But the fact of now me saying that I don't really like that compromise, but if you take my point to modify the solution, I might accept it. But I don't know whether Leon will accept it. He then uses this. He goes to say, I've come with a compromise. And I've discussed it with Idris. He suggests that we put this modification. Then you might say, yeah, I can accept that, but I would also like to have another modification. Then he comes back to me, another round. This is a long drawn process. And he comes out and say, well, this is the second round. The fact that he goes around this, if it is problematic, then he will ask me and ask you, who are people that you trust that can come and join in this discussion, that will understand you and understand me? Let's say you nominate 2 more people, I nominate 2 more people. Then this guy will interview them as well. And then he will then find the majority views. He said there's common views among all that this is a position that everybody have. Almost bringing democracy into practice. And so when you say the majority view is this, then suddenly the guy says, yeah, there are a lot of people are saying maybe I should start looking at myself. And I start looking at myself. And if you start looking at myself, so that it's a lengthy process. But polarities are not easy to deal with. And that is why it's lengthy.
And it's very important that we point that out, because sometimes, and I think we also have to be reminded of this, well, don't know about you, but at least for me personally, because one of our mottos that we live by, not only in this family, but then even in the workplace, is these 3 words: big, fast, results. So naturally we think that everything needs to be big, everything needs to be fast. But the reality is that there are some things that cannot be fast. And I think anything that has to do with finding compromise, being able to manage a polarity in this sense, a lot more complicated, because you're dealing with human beings and human emotions and egos and all of that. It's a lot more nuanced. And so we have to accept that these are things that are going to take a long time. And it's not even a long time to be able to solve a problem. It's that this will take a long time for us to even be at a place where we can manage the polarity well. And it's important that we then acknowledge that, because if we acknowledge that, first of all, a polarity to be managed is always going to be a polarity to be managed, where again we're drawing a distinction between polarity to be managed, problem to be solved. So as it is, we're accepting that that is an infinite time scale that we will be managing this polarity. But we are talking about the speed at which we become more adept at managing the polarity, and that takes a long time. And so what that reminded me of is an interesting framing and an interesting posture that was shared by Pastor Benny Ho. You know him.
Yes.
So he came to speak with our team a couple of months ago, and he said this line, which to be honest, when he first said it, I didn't quite understand what he meant. He said that your most important team is the team that you belong to. And at first I thought about it. I said, what does he mean by that? Surely we belong to all of our teams.
Yeah.
But his point here was that you mentioned the word tribalism earlier. Sometimes even in a workplace, there can be a tendency for tribalism to play out. Tribalism between departments. My department is superior, is better than your department. And so why he wanted to say that was that in a church context, then sometimes we might think that our primary focus is on our particular ministry. Let's say you do a discipleship ministry or a leadership development ministry. I only care for things to do with that ministry. His point is that your most important team is not your department, it's not your ministry, but it is the wider team that ministry sits within, which in this case is the wider church as a whole. And so his point was we need to start to do away with this kind of tribalistic approach and think of what is ultimately the wider team that we belong to. Because perhaps once we get that posture, then it might be easier for us to not only accept the fact that some things will never be solved, but it will also allow us the patience to be able to persevere through that maybe lengthier process of trying to better understand the other people as well. And I think we can look at it like that as well in the sense of even between warring nations, there are obviously different ideologies.
Definitely.
There are different ideologies, but at the end of the day, if we zoom out and think, what is the team that we all belong to? It's the world. It's the world at large. And what are some key things that we want to see happening in the world? We obviously, most people at least, unless you're a sociopath, you would want equality. You would want there to be social justice. And you would generally want and hope for the welfare of human beings at large. And so when we think of who we belong to and the world that we belong to, then it becomes easier for us to hopefully be able to hold some of our views a little more lightly and to find that common ground, even though the how might be slightly different.
Let me just bring one practical, real example. Many years ago when I was a minister, I know I talked about it previously, but I just want to say one more time, a polarity that I really encountered. When I was a minister, we were looking at a list of people who are in the B40 that we needed to tackle. Most of them were Malays and the Bumi Putra, if you like. There were Sarawakians, there were Sabahans, poor, not just Malays, the natives from there. But then there are also Chinese in the B40. They're also Indians. So we took a very robust approach and dealt with all of them, all the B40, regardless of race and religion. And we were misunderstood. Ibrahim Ali, who was very ultra, his voice and opinion was totally different. He and his people, his group, believed that we have become completely a group of people in PEMANDU that rejected the Bumi Putra privileges. So the Bumi Putra rights. So he came with 20 people with a referendum. He came to my office, really wanted to hand over a referendum that he said this is a polarity between Bumi Putra versus non-Bumi Putra. That's the polarity. So when he came to my room, I remember sitting down here. There are 20 of them on the opposite side. The first thing I told him very politely that I'm also Bumi Putra like him. There are many, many people, tribal people like me, who are even poorer than Malays. The statistics shows very clearly that there's so many of people who are from different tribes, not just Muslim Malays, that are very poor, and so are the Chinese. And so I didn't say to him, that's a starting point. So I kind of understand where you're coming from. I know where you're coming from. But I want to stop the discourse. Instead of you and I talk about it from the two poles, I want to bring it down to practical examples. So I brought the examples down. So there are on the list of the poor people at B40, there is 36,000 families that we wanted to deal with. These are the names. I gave some example. I picked a family from Cheras. And this was an Indian family. They were very poor and described exactly what the condition of the family is. The father has no job, his wife is also no job, and they had all sorts of difficulties in their families. I asked him point blank, Ibrahim Ali, do you agree that the government should help this family, yes or no? He said yes. Then I took another example. This one is in Puchong. This is the Chinese family. And they described precisely the condition of the family, that they really needed help. And I asked him the same question. Then he also agreed that we should help that group. Then I said, by the way, the 36,000 that we talked about, 70% of the 36,000 are Bumi Putras, Malays and natives to Sabah and Sarawak, orang asli. But there are 30% that come from the Chinese in the Indian community and the others. And you have already said clearly that you also agree that we should help the Chinese family in Puchong and the Indian family in Cheras. You know what he said? Saudara Idris, macam ni kita tak ada masalah lah. Kita minum teh sajalah. Ini referendum kita simpan dalam bag.
Yeah. In English, that means, Dato Sri, it looks like we don't have a problem anymore. All I propose we do now is that we have some tea.
Yeah.
And in fact, why don't I put my referendum back in the bag?
That's it. And so if you take the lesson learned from there, if I had a discussion and discourse with him about the polarity, Bumi Putra versus Bumi Putra rights, he and I would have gone through a very heavy polemic, very heavy debate about rights of the different tribes, groups of people. But I brought it down to practical example. When I brought it down to practical example, then he realized, yeah, we had no differences. From that moment onwards, Ibrahim Ali and myself had remained, I wouldn't say friends, but I can text him, so he understands where I come from.
Yeah. And I think that's the key thing, because, the reason why people sometimes struggle to, and this is maybe more specific to the area of receiving feedback, is that because we have these two desires as human beings at odds with one another. On the one hand, there's the desire for growth, but on the other hand, there's also a desire to feel accepted or to be accepted. And when it comes to feedback, even if the feedback is objectively good and constructive feedback for you, our Vicar Abel, he put this illustration together to say that if you put the desire for growth, the desire to feel accepted in a boxing match with one another, usually the desire for feeling accepted will outpunch the desire for growth. And what happens when you give feedback, what that does is that it threatens our desire for being accepted. Or, as you said, to feel understood. And I think the real key is sometimes to show people that we are at least willing and seeking to understand. And understanding doesn't necessarily mean that we come to agreement. I can understand your point of view and still ultimately disagree with it respectfully. But the point is, if I've at least shown that I understand where you're coming from first, and then still say at the end of the day, I disagree, I think you are probably less likely to be upset with my stance as well. And I'm probably less likely to antagonize you and vice versa as well. So just to be clear, I think for those of us who are maybe wanting to engage in any sort of discourse, or even if it's a grievance between colleagues, even within your family members, I think the first point of call as you're having these conversations is to maybe just ask yourself, where can I seek to understand this other person better? And how can you make that very clear from the very early point of the conversation?
Absolutely.
Because if you don't do that early on, then it becomes too late, because now you go down this very messy road of just dealing with these polarizing views, as opposed to first saying, here is our point of commonality. This is an intended outcome, but regardless of what the outcome is, at least I want to show that we both have sought to understand one another before we agree, or maybe even agree to disagree at the end.
Yeah, talking about interfaith dialogue and challenges of that nature. 3 weeks ago, I had a meeting with our minister, Dato Sri Aaron Ago, and the KSU, the TKSU, and people in his office. They were talking about what we can do to really get people in Malaysia to continue to become more and more united rather than fracture. And so it's very important. So I sketched to him the need for us in Malaysia to follow the ladder of unity that we described before: tolerance, acceptance, and celebration. And so he and the team, they are planning to organize a kind of huge national conference early next year, maybe January, to try and get various people with different opinions and try to have a discourse around opinions, whether it's to do with Bumi Putra versus Bumi Putra, the have versus the have-nots, the rich versus the poor, all the tensions that exist in our society, and try to get people to understand the other side of the pole, and then we can then migrate. So I suggested to him, if we were to produce a questionnaire for people to be able to fill it, to assess themselves. If they fill this questionnaire, quite sophisticated, you will then be able to see where do you stand personally on that ladder of unity. Do you stand at level 1 or do you stand at level 2, and you will stand at level 3? And if you stand at level 1, what are the handrails of things you can do to then improve yourself so that you migrate towards level 2 and level 3? And if we can start doing that, then it becomes a very practical guide for how Malaysians will become more and more united. You can stretch this on religious issues, on educational issues, on poverty, on all sorts of things of that nature. And if we start moving in that direction, we will do. Because today, the discourse cannot just be at a philosophical 30,000 feet. You need practical handrails. And I suggested to them, if we had 5,000 people attending this conference, then perhaps we should get them to do using a Slido survey, where do the Malaysians stand on this ladder today? And if we stand at level 1, we fundamentally have a lot of work to do to migrate people to level 2 and level 3. And only, to my mind, if you at level 3, you have no problem with discourse about differences. If you're level 2, you have a lot more challenges. But if you're level 1, you have a lot of difficulties.
Where do you think we are as a nation currently?
I think in Malaysia, we are at level 1. We've got a long way to go to move to level 2. That's why today, we just say, let's not talk about it. When you are at society, when you say there are certain things we shouldn't talk about it, when we say 3R, we don't talk.
Right.
Race, religion, that means you are already not prepared to engage because you are already at level 1. And so to my mind,
point, before recording, we were even questioning whether or not we should even have this discussion today, whether it might unnecessarily ruffle feathers as well. So maybe that speaks to where we are currently in our ability to have discourse.
I think if we're at the level of celebrating each other's diversity, if we know what is good in the other religion, what is good in the other race, then you celebrate that. I think that's the time when you can really begin to have a constructive dialogue about how to come with common grounds to move forward. Let's face it, Malaysia, we are a diverse society. We use this word called unity and diversity so often, but we never really come down and say, let's now leverage this and move it forward. I mean, workplace. You see today, the unfortunate thing today is look at government-linked companies. Government-linked companies is just full of Bumi Putras or Malays inside government-linked companies. But then you look at the Chinese companies, full of Chinese inside there. Indian companies with perhaps similar too. But my point is that if we live parallel lives like that, this is not good, And so you see today, the saddest part is that you will find we used to have national schools where all the races are there. national schools are predominantly Malays and the Bumi Putras and there. But most of the Malays and the Chinese and the others are there in the private school. And so when we live these parallel lives, very hard to us to deal with contentious issues moving forward. In a mature society, we shouldn't, to my mind, mature society, when we know how to celebrate our differences, we shouldn't have difficulty with the 3R. Because we can discourse, we can really talk about it, we find common ground to respect and celebrate our differences. And that's how we move forward as a society.
Yeah. And I think there's never been a better opportunity or glimmer of hope for Malaysia to be able to reach that place, because the beauty of podcasts as a medium is that podcasts allow people to have discourse and allow for said discourse to then be amplified and socialized as well. And so our hope is that hopefully, with more people talking about maybe uncomfortable things on podcasts like this, people like Keluar Sekejap and other platforms as well, that hopefully we'll be able to influence different fields of influence, to be able to arrive at this same unity that you talked about, and for people to eventually develop the language and vocabulary for having difficult conversations, uncomfortable conversations, but ultimately I think conversations that will help us to get towards a singular greater good. And I think the one thing that we must always remember is that in doing so, I think the bedrock of all that we do should be to seek to understand first before we share our respective opinions, and that categorically, violence should never be the answer, no matter who, no matter what the situation. And with that, I think this is a good place to end today's episode. Thank you guys for listening to yet another episode of the Game of Impossible podcast. We hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you did, we encourage you to subscribe to both our YouTube and Spotify. We put up episodes every Friday at 6 a.m. And we also have short form content on both our IG and TikTok at the Game of Impossible. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next week.